Last week, the United States Senate finally broke through the gridlock and voted to change our archaic tax code once and for all. But it only took 31 years to get here, Mr. President, 31 years. Along with regulatory relief, and by the way, so far this year, this body and this administration have removed 860 regulations and rules from the rule book here in Washington that have been sucking the very life out of our free enterprise system over the last 8 years or so. But along with regulatory relief and unleashing our energy potential, this is the single most important thing we can do to unleash our economic growth and bring relief to American workers. These changes to the tax code are a win for American families, American workers, and American businesses. Let me just give you a couple examples, Mr. President. The family of four that makes a median income today of $73,000 a year will see their tax bill go down by $2,200 a month. Now, that's a 60% reduction in their federal income tax, Mr. President. A single parent, single mom with one child making the median income will get a 75% tax cut. The standard deduction is doubled. Child care credit is doubled to $2,000, Mr. President. The individual mandate that was unleashed on the American people by Obamacare is eliminated. And by the way, just in 2014 alone, that's the latest year we have any official records from the IRS, this insidious part, this mandate, fined 8 million Americans $2 billion, Mr. President, and the irony of that is almost half of those people make less than $25,000 a year. In addition to those changes, one I love and one my mother and father will love, they were public school teachers. Teacher expense deduction has been doubled under this bill. In addition, 6 million taxpayers have been removed from the federal income tax roll, and that's just the half of it. Businesses see their corporate tax rate go from 35% to 20%, allowing them to create jobs here in America and expand production and compete with the rest of the world. Our archaic repatriation tax, we're the last major country in the world to have a double tax on profits made by U.S. companies around the world. That's some $2.6 trillion by some estimates we hope will be reinvested here in the United States. According to outside analysts, this bill creates 1 million new jobs, Mr. President, and the average compensation of the average family in America should go up by $4,000. Some estimate as high as $9,000 per year. The GDP only has to go from 1.9% to 2.1%, Mr. President, to more than pay for all of this. Now, that's not my estimate. That's the estimate of the Joint Committee on Tax. Well, if you don't believe them, then the Congressional Budget Office, which we have all kinds of problems with, but even they say that you only have to grow the economy 0.4. So from 1.9 to 2.3%, Mr. President, to more than pay for this investment in the American worker. I would argue that because of the last 2 quarters, we're already seeing 3% growth because primarily of the expectation that we're going to act on tax and because of the reality of the fact that we've been moving on the regulatory regime that has been perpetrated on the American worker these last 8 years. A lot of benefits, Mr. President, but you know, in my opinion, the person who benefits from this tax bill the most is that person in America who gets a job. When it comes to the corporate rate, I've personally seen firsthand how important it is to have a rate that allows American workers to compete with their counterparts around the world. The most stimulative part of this tax bill, in my opinion, is this corporate tax cut because of the impact it will have on our businesses and workers and because it creates a level playing field with the rest of the world. But let's be very clear. My original goal was 15%, Mr. President, because I know this is a dynamic situation where the rest of the world today is going to move because of what we're doing. Both the House and the Senate agreed on 20%. Now there's some talk about changing in conference. But my question is this, the House bill approved 20%, the Senate approved 20%. The purpose of this conference is to work between those two decisions to find the differences and mold those into a final bill that both the House and the Senate can vote on. My question for this body is, and for this conference, is what's between 20 and 20, Mr. President? I don't quite understand this. This seems to be, should be a no-brainer. The best thing we can do for people in the United States who work with their hands, Mr. President, every day, these are people that punch a time clock, just like I did when I was working my way through college. But the best thing we can do for them is to create a level playing field with the rest of the world and lower this corporate tax rate. The current rate sends jobs overseas and keeps our workers from competing on a level play. We have the best workforce in the history of the world, Mr. President, and yet we have hamstrung them such that other companies can come to the United States and buy our companies and take those jobs overseas. We need to get this tax rate competitive and as low as possible. Otherwise, other countries will immediately lower their rates and we'll still be at a significant disadvantage. Look, if we don't take bold action right now, we may not get the chance to do so again for another 30 years. We need to make sure we don't get outpaced by other countries, even after we make these tax changes. But let me just describe why this is so important. Today, with a tax rate of 35%, Mr. President, Asia right now averages about 18%, Europe about 20%. And so if we go to 20%, the rest of the world is going to move. We already know that the United Kingdom is moving to 15%. Others are talking about it as well. But today we have a 50% differential, and that difference allows companies in other countries to come to this country, buy our companies, and use that tax differential to pay for part of the acquisition cost. Now what that does is that takes jobs overseas and actually thwarts our ability to compete. Today there are because of this reality and because of this 50% differential, there are twice as many foreign companies buying U.S. companies, both C corporations and pass-throughs, as there are U.S. companies buying foreign companies. Mr. President, we simply have to change that. Let me give you some examples of how competitive this and how dynamic this issue about corporate tax rate is. Germany today has a 16% tax rate. That compares to our 35% top tax rate. The UK today is 19%, but as I said earlier, they've already announced they're going to 17% next year, Mr. President. France and the Netherlands have also announced that they're going to take rates lower next year. When the UK goes to 17%, France lowers theirs, the Netherlands lowers theirs, Germany is sitting right there already at 16%. If we increase this corporate tax rate from what we've already agreed to in our negotiations in this body, then we'll replicate the 50% differential with the rest of the world almost immediately. So, Mr. President, we will have accomplished nothing. The greatest burden on the American worker, again, is this corporate tax rate of 35%. It's estimated that every 1% drop in the corporate tax rate could mean roughly 30,000 new jobs in an economy that's $30 billion larger. We can't afford to play around with this corporate tax rate that we've already agreed on, Mr. President. It's time to stop that debate. All of these changes to the tax code, though, are meant to lift up Americans. Simply put, it's the family that will benefit from this. It's the individual that's trying to get an education, get that first job. It's those people who are going to retire and depend on a robust federal government to take care of them in their retirement, Mr. President. But right now, with this debt crisis, we're losing the ability to do the right thing. Members of both sides of the aisle have previously supported many of these changes to the tax code. There was no reason to vote no on this bill, and there's no reason to not support them now. The United States made history the other night, Mr. President, about 2 a.m. Saturday morning by approving this plan. We now have certain individuals from this body and the House that will go into a conference, and they'll work out the differences between the House bill and the Senate bill. That's called democracy. And I'm looking forward to see that bill come back to this body. We must not lose sight of what this is all about, to bring relief to Americans and help us become more competitive. We cannot take this standard of living for granted. This body is great at spending money, Mr. President, but right now every dollar we spend of discretionary money, by definition, is borrowed money. This can no longer be the case. This tax bill is clearly an investment in our future. Mr. President, I'm not embarrassed to say that I believe in capitalism. Capitalism is what made this country different from any other country in the world so far. Right now, the economic miracle of this past century is based on three simple things: innovation, capital formation, and the rule of law. That, combined with the best workforce in the history of the world, has created this economic miracle. And yet we sit here today where my children, the next generation, is the first generation in the history of our country that face lower economic prospects than the generation before them. That does not have to be the case, Mr. President. It's up to this body to stand up and do what's right for the next generation. This is a critical part. Don't miss this. This is a critical part to solving our debt crisis. This is the least we owe to our children and our children's children. We must continue doing all we can to make sure that we put this tax bill on President Trump's desk before Christmas. Our children and our children's children's futures depend on it. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
The Senator from Tennessee.